Hello and welcome back to another edition of Viper Bites primetime previews. Monday Night Football, Seattle Seahawks, Washington football team. The 3-7 Seahawks head to the nation's capital, take on that football team who happens to be 4-6, and still they're kind of in the whole mix of things here right now. So every game matters from Thanksgiving on. Basically, when you look at it, it's the Thanksgiving matchups. That is when the playoffs start for a lot of teams, especially they start to jockey for that playoff positioning. But before we get into this tail of the tape, a little housekeeping here. If you're watching us on the Vipers Network, make sure to hit that good old-fashioned thumbs up. There it is right there. And make sure to subscribe so you get the latest videos each and every week as we come back with new content all the time, including the Dynasty Vipers Vipercast every Tuesday, 10 p.m. Eastern. And of course, if you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, rate and review us. Take a second. We greatly appreciate that. If you got questions, I've got the answers. Head over to @MattDonnellyFF on the Twitter, and we'll get those answers to you as soon as possible. Now, let's dive right in here, and let's talk about the Seattle Seahawks and the quarterback position. Let Russell Wilson cook, you say. Well, lately he's been cooking nothing but cereal, burnt toast, and soggy wieners. And my 7-year-old, he is more than capable of doing that himself, which has been leaving fantasy managers hungry and with a very bad taste in their mouths as of late. Now, his 16.54 fantasy points per game have him ranked as the 21st quarterback on the fantasy pecking order. And since returning from his finger injury, he has posted back-to-back 7.6 and 8.5 fantasy performances. It goes a little further back if you use the 17 points as the standard for a solid start. Wilson has one of those in the last 5 contests. His 34 of 66 completions there in the last 2 weeks has added up to 368 yards and 2 interceptions while fumbling twice. You can't feel comfortable starting him until you see something more from him. That finger may be more problematic than what we thought of at first. Now, I'm pretty sure that Sierra would find a way to top him in completion percentages. He's only completed 52% of those passes. If there was a week, any week, to break out of this funk, it has to be against the worst fantasy team in fantasy football when it comes to defending the quarterback position. The football team has allowed an average of 23.86 fantasy points per outing this season, and quarterbacks have thrown for 2,800 yards, 24 touchdowns, while Washington has, forced only 6 interceptions. So you got to be feeling pretty good about Russell Wilson this week, except I don't. Now, Alex Collins, Rashad Penny, they combined for 12 carries and 55 yards last week against the Cardinals. Now, the Cardinals, they're a good defense, but neither Collins and especially not Penny strike fear in defensive coordinators or front sevens. That's just the facts. Now, Washington has allowed 23.28 fantasy points per game, which ranks about 19th, while allowing 695 yards on the ground, as well as 383 in the passing game, 2 backs. They have also allowed the 9th most rushing touchdowns, 8, and the 3rd most receiving touchdowns, 4 to opposing backs. Collins is averaging about 6.4 fantasy points per game, but he hasn't had more than 10 fantasy points since week 6. He's only accomplished that feat twice in 9 games. Yeah, I'm avoiding the Seahawks running backs here as well. Now, will it be DK Metcalf? Will it be Tyler Lockett? That seems to be the question we are asking each and every single week. And the answer is rarely both. Now, this is a great matchup for Russell Wilson to get cooking. So let's hope that DK Metcalf can set the table this week against a team that is allowing the 4th most fantasy points to receivers, allowing 40.52 per game, which means maybe, just maybe, this is that rare week in which both Seahawks receivers can produce. Now, Washington on the season has allowed 1,817 yards, which happens to be the 4th most, and 13 touchdowns, which is the 5th most, to receivers. Great news, as Metcalf comes into this one as a wide receiver 18 in 10 games, posting 157.7 fantasy points. Metcalf started the season with 8 straight games with 11 or more fantasy points, and some of those came even with Geno Smith under center. Now, the last 2 weeks, Metcalf hasn't been feeling whatever Russell Wilson's been dishing. Metcalf ain't been eating because he's only got 7.5 fantasy points and or 35 or more receiving yards, despite seeing 8 targets in both those games since Wilson's return. Now, speaking of Tyler Lockett, Lockett is right behind Metcalf in PPR scoring, sitting at the wide receiver 24 spot with 136.7, but has been doing Tyler Lockett type things all season with 5 games with more than 10 fantasy points and 5 games with less than 7.5 fantasy points. And it is truly the Lockett experience to watch him post 4 100-yard receiving games, then see him go 6 games with less than 60 yards. Last week was a good week. 4 catches, 115 yards, but he still hasn't found the end zone since way back in week number 2. Something has to give. Either the Seahawks receivers get going this week or Washington finds a way to shut down receivers, because it ain't going to be both here. I promise you that. Now, at the tight end position for Seattle, Gerald Everett will see the 16th ranked fantasy defense when it comes to tight ends this week, a defense that has allowed 12.79 fantasy points per game. Everett has one statistical relevance game this season, and that came against Green Bay back in week number 10, where he had 8 catches for 63 yards. Just enough to pique the interest once again of fantasy managers everywhere. Now let's flip that script over to the nation's capital, and let's talk about the football team. Tyler Heinicke has done some good things under center, earning the opportunity to start and to continue to be the starter moving forward. His 2,390 passing yards ranks 16th, and he has completed 217 of those 328 passes this year, which is good for about a 66.2% completion percentage. He also comes into this match as a fringe QB1. Yes, you heard me. Fringe QB1, sitting 15th in fantasy scoring, sitting 12 points back of Ryan Tannehill, who currently occupies the 10th spot in that fantasy quarterback pecking order. And this week, he faces a Seahawks team that is allowing 17.73 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks. Seattle has allowed the 6th most passing yards this season, 2,917, along with 14 touchdowns. Heinicke is averaging 17.8 fantasy points per game and is coming off a 23-point performance against the Carolina Panthers that saw him throw for 3 touchdowns. To the running back position here, Antonio Gibson looks to be getting a little bit more of that workload the last couple weeks. Coming off that week 9 bye, he's had a little bit more time to rehab whatever has been ailing him this season, as Gibson has now seen 43 carries in the previous 2 weeks. In those 2 contests against the Bucs and the Panthers, he has touched the ball 45 times for 173 yards and 2 touchdowns. With the increased workload for Gibson, it means that McKissic has trended downward somewhat. Now, the Washington football team has won 2 in a row, which means they haven't needed McKissic's specific skill set. But this week against Seattle, both backs could be in line to produce under the primetime lights. McKissic has recorded 38 receptions on 48 targets this season for 371 yards, while the Seahawks have allowed a league-high 726 receiving yards to running backs this season. That's part of the reason Seattle has the 31st ranked defense against fantasy backs, allowing 30 fantasy points per game. And the only other team that's allowed 30 points or more has been the New York Football Jets. So I feel comfortable going RB2 for Gibson, strong flex RB3 for McKissic this week. To the wide receiver position, and to the one and only Terry McLaurin, who faces the 19th ranked defense against wide receivers for fantasy purposes. The Seahawks are allowing 35.18 points per game and have allowed 1,654 receiving yards, surrendering only 7 touchdowns thus far this season, what happens to be the 4th fewest. Now, McLaurin is 23rd in receptions with 54, 14th in yardage with 735, and is tied for 18th with 5 touchdown receptions so far. Now, add that all up, bippity-boppity-boo, and you get 158.7 fantasy points, which has him sitting in the 17th position, 1 spot ahead of the earlier mentioned DK Metcalf. Now, McLaurin also comes into this one on a bit of a high note, recording his 4th 100-yard game of the season last week, hitting the Panthers up for 103 yards on 5 receptions and scoring for the 5th time this season. While Seattle has been improving against receivers in fantasy, PFF still has them graded as the 27th team when it comes to pass coverage, which strongly benefits Terry McLaurin in this one. Now, DeAndre Carter, Adam Humphries, who is next in line in Washington? Seattle is 25th in DVOA, which is basically the defensive adjusted value over the average, which is a metric used to calculate a team's success based on down and distance on each play. Humphries has the edge in receptions, 23-14, and in targets, 32-26. But Carter has 3 touchdowns to Humphries 0. And their yardage is pretty equal there, with Humphries edging out Carter 255-219. Carter is the wide receiver 72, but has scored in 3 straight games. In those 3 games, he has 8 catches for 129 yards and has seen 15 targets. Until Humphries starts finding the end zone himself, you can't start him. You probably shouldn't start Carter anyway, but you know what? We like them fantasy tutties, and Carter, he's kind of rolling here the last 3 weeks, so he's worth a flyer if you're desperate and in deeper leagues. Good news, though, there could be some more possible positive reinforcement coming for the Washington passing game in the fact that Curtis Samuel was out at practice Friday for the media portion along with Logan Thomas. Samuel has been sidelined since week number 5 with a groin injury, and he's caught 4 or 5 targets for 19 yards. Basically, he only played 1 game, came in, played a couple snaps, and he was done for the rest of the season. Now, Logan Thomas, John Bates there, he will get the start if Logan Thomas is unavailable once again, but all indications are that Thomas has been moving well in practice this week and has a real shot to play Monday night. Bates last week finished with 3 receptions for 23 yards in the football team's 27-21 victory over the Panthers. Let's be honest, though. As Bates provides something for Washington, he provides very little for fantasy managers who have longed for the return of Logan Thomas back into their lineups, making the push for those playoff positioning. Prior to his injury, Logan Thomas was averaging 11.2 fantasy points per game through 3 weeks. That average works out to about the 9th best amongst all tight ends in 2021. And you know Heinicke can't wait to get that big target back in the lineup. Now, with that all said, this has been another edition of Viper Bites, primetime edition, Monday Night Football. Make sure to head over to fantasypoints.com. Get that subscription today. Use promo code 21Vipers10, and you get 10% off. With that being said, we'll catch you next time. Take care now.